So, jetzt bin ich genau in der Zeit, 15 Minuten, und würde damit den offiziellen Teil dieses Sommersymposiums einleiten mit dem ersten Vortrag, wie Sie hier sehen, von Raúl Acosta García, ich leite Sie noch ganz kurz ein, aber ich bin gerne schon, genau, den Sie in Zukunft hier öfter sehen werden, denn, vielleicht fange ich damit an, ab kommenden Semester wird er Vertretungsprofessor hier sein für Frau Whittaker, die ein Forschungssemester hat und vertreten wird durch Herrn Raúl Acosta García, der in Oxford seine Doktorarbeit abgeschlossen hat zum Thema Managing Descent, Advocacy Networks in the Brazilian Amazon and the Mediterranean. Danach hat er mehrere Jahre, 16 bis 19, also 3-4 Jahre, ein eigenes DFG-Projekt mit dem Titel Aspirational Activism in Urban Latin America durchgeführt und ist jetzt seit 2019 auch Leiter eines Subprojekts innerhalb eines größeren Forschungsprojektes zu urbane Ethiken, und wie ich gerade hörte, sind Sie auch ganz aktiv in der Stadtethnologie AG der DFG. Ja, Sie sind derzeit an der LMU in München und demnächst dann bei uns. Wunderbar. Und jetzt gebe ich Ihnen das Wort. Und mache mal eben Ihre Präsentation auf. Zeigen Sie mir noch welche? Ah, da ist es. Mal, müsste es eigentlich funktionieren? Ah, das ist noch. Okay, so. Wunderbar. Sie sagen mir noch, geht das so? Wenn Sie einfach.
Ja.
Okay, alles klar. Gut.
Zuallererst vielen Dank und entschuldige mich, weil ich auf Englisch machen muss. First, I'm going to set the scene. I'm going to welcome you to Mexico City. This is a morning, a rush hour morning in January 2020. The traffic is more orderly than it used to be a few years ago. There are more cyclists. You can see one here, but there are plenty passing through. And there are proper bus stops, which is somewhat of a novelty in Mexico City. And there are also pedestrian lights that are also relatively new. I talked to many people crossing the streets there, and some of them told me, like Marta, a 40-year-old Marta told me, I don't like cycleways because they take space from us pedestrians. 23-year-old Carlo told me that he, and I quote, the new infrastructures are good as they provide more security, but people are very rude because everybody is in a hurry. 21-year-old Rosa told me that this crossing is very dangerous because you never know where cars may come from. So I'm going to explain to you the main thesis of my habilitation. This is what I'm preparing now. And it's that the changes that are evident in urban mobility in Mexico City have altered social interactions, multiplying debates on urban ethics in the public sphere. The way I define urban ethics is that they are negotiations in practice and in discourse about what is better not for individuals, but for the collective itself, in this case the city. And I refer to it as proto-political because I believe that it's, as I define it, a social space in which people realize they share more than they had imagined, not only as a community of sorts, but also regarding the territory they inhabit. And this may lead to political action. It's not a direct equation, but it may lead to that. And the way I sustain it is within the Urban Ethics Research Group, as was already said. We have been working in an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary group in 12 cities around the world in a very different contexts, funded by the DFG. And in Mexico City, what I did was from 2018 to 2020, I did 8 months of ethnographic research among what I call the mobility milieu. That is made of activists, urban designers, NGO advocates, technicians, academics, international organizations, and government officials. And what I was interested in, it was not only what they are doing in changing the city itself, but how what they are doing actually is altering the way that people get along and interact in the city. So I was talking to a lot of users of those spaces, but also to a lot of activists and people involved, because they would share with me the way that they got activated or inspired to do this kind of work. Now, the closest theoretical insights in anthropology to this research would be in Michael Lambeck's Ordinary Ethics. Michael Lambeck argues that ordinary ethics are intrinsic to human action, and they are in many interactions that we live. Vena Das added that they are simply parts of our life with others. So in this sense, they are just a natural part of our interactions. But I share more Jared Seigel's critique, which I simplify a lot here, but he criticizes this ordinary ethics aspect, because he says that it, as other types of philosophy, it shares an a priori, that it assumes that there's already a vision of what is good, and it only arranges things towards that. So what he argues for is more an ethics of dwelling, he calls it, where people put in practice a world they long for, effectively enacting a politics of world building. He refers to world building precisely as giving shape to the place where people are actually living. And this builds on Tim Ingold's perception of the environment, where he develops the concept of dwelling, and he argues that us humans, as animals, as other animals do, we shape the place where we live. So many animals shape not only their nests or their places where they grow their offspring, but also the places where they inhabit with others. And this is a basis for the argument. And this is related to what I noticed in Mexico City, that sensory experience is central to not only to activism, but to what they are trying to do. It serves as well, first of all, to motivate activists. Many activists told me how, when they started cycling the city, because many of them actually started as adults, because there was no history of cycling massively in Mexico City. Many of them had only learned as children and then left it, and only recently did they take it up again. I myself am originally from Mexico City. I lived away for a long time, and during this fieldwork, I saw more bicycles in one day than I did in my 15 years living in Mexico City. So that should summarize a little bit. But what many activists told me was that the way that they experienced the city motivated them to try to share that experience with others. But also I've written elsewhere, already published a couple of articles, about what I believe is a type of phenomenological activism that activists show by doing. And in doing so, they are actually helping others imagine what being a cyclist is in the city. To promote cycling among urban dwellers, but also to promote more awareness and better behavior from drivers and others. And there are two activities that are central to this. One of them is by activists who started doing night rides 20 years ago. And first they were just a few friends who got together, but as they became more well-known, now they are hundreds who get together, especially on Wednesday evenings, but now there are dozens of groups that get together every night of the week in different corners, in different barrios, and do different night rides. And many activists told me that these night rides helped them notice that actually it was easier to get to places, that the city was not as big as they feared, because the difference of how they would experience the city, and that motivated them to use the bicycle on a daily basis. And the other activity are the Sunday rides, that the government closes a few avenues. In the time of fieldwork, it was 55 kilometers of avenues and streets, and for people to use them as a park on Sunday mornings. And that has brought out a lot of people who experience the city differently, but also crucially for my research, has allowed for encounters between socioeconomic groups that are seldom seen in Mexico, because Mexico is one of the most unequal places on earth, and it's very fragmented in the way that the city is designed. So there are many gated communities and shopping centers that exclude some people. And in these places, I have noticed a lot of interactions that tend to blur those lines. So that has helped. But also part of the root of this change are environmental concerns. And this can be from micro scale. So many activists told me that the way that also they feel the air that they're breathing, that they motivated them to actually try to promote a change of fuel. There was one campaign that they followed that was called Hazla de tos, which is a word play in which Hazla de tos means to make a fuss about something, but tos is also coughing. So it's to draw attention of the bad quality of air, and it also asked for a change in fuel, and that helped to improve the quality of fuel to reduce emissions in the city, and that was a massive change that happened in the city. So it's from these type of micro scales of the immediate interactions of individuals to the meso in social media and mainstream media. There are debates about the city to the macro. So there are also discussions about climate change and reducing climate emissions. But the example that I'm showing you here, this is a photo of the Ecoducto, a linear park in Mexico City that is in the middle of a huge avenue. You can see that it has 12 lanes. As I walked through this park, I could not hear the sound of the traffic, and I could not smell the emissions of the cars, because all these plants are working as a filter, both of sound but also of particles. And plus, but also what it refers to is a type of campaign to allow the urban ecosystem to recuperate itself. Because this avenue used to be a water body, a river, and it has been intubulated and now is part of the sewage network. But what activists promoted, this was an initiative promoted by activists, cycle activists on the one hand, is that actually they use some of the liquid of that sewage, they filter it through natural processes, and they use that to water these plants. So it's a way to show that the same environment can have virtuous cycles to improve the city. And the view in their stages that are planned is that eventually they will recuperate this river with cycleways on the sides. So that's their dream, but it's a vision of the future. And I call this a type of engagement a trans-scalar entanglements. And part of this has to do with these public debates on urban ethics, in which mobility has become an arena rife with ethical negotiations. Many discussions are on about what is good for the city or bad, and there are many denunciations and a call to action, much more than in other places. So the social media has allowed for a lot fairer debates between different actors, and it may allow very small activist groups to suddenly have much more influence than they would have had without this. And this has to do also with how some activists have used technocratic means to actually try to get policymakers to pay attention. There's one government official who used to be an activist, who has been in government now for a few years, who has a mantra to try to convince activists to alter the way that they do things. And she says that what is not counted does not count. And that way she tries to convince many people, many activists, to alter the way that they do their demands or the denunciations, to include data. And what I'm including here is a photo of a bicycle counter that was installed in Mexico City to count the number of cyclists going through this cycleway, one of the new cycleways in an important avenue. And this is part of what I use as a term as techno-moral governance, which is a concept that anthropologists in the US have used for NGO advocacy networks, where morality has been embedded in the use of technical information. And that way it adds to the ethicization of public debates and discourses. Another sphere is something that I recently presented elsewhere, is ethical capital, that I believe that mobility activists actually accumulate and use ethical capital, which is inspired by Bourdieu. I argue that is one type of symbolic capital that is different to the financial, social, and cultural capitals that you identified, but that it is symbolic in the fact that it is accumulated by the legitimacy that activists accumulate by organizing events or participating in the public sphere in favor of the campaigns they establish. And this photo that I'm showing is about an activity and an immersion that is organized by an NGO promoting cycling to school. So they involve schools, students, and local authorities to show how beneficial it would be if streets were safer for children to cycle to school. And it was a way to spur debates about it, and it has definitely helped to think differently about these issues. So all of this, I believe, adds to a sense of the proto-political. So I differentiate between the activist groups who actually engage in political activities, more in the politics, in the sphere of politics, as differentiated by Move, who argues about the political as different to politics. So these groups actually do engage in politics, but I argue that the proto-political is the milieu that they are producing, in which people see themselves differently. And what I've noticed in some declarations, like the ones I quoted at the beginning, was a different way of addressing their own role of many urban dwellers in the city or regarding the city than it used to be. Some analysts had argued that in Mexico City for a long time it was more a case of subjugation instead of subjectivation. So people saw themselves as having to follow orders. Mexico was a one single party regime for most of the 20th century, and it was a soft dictatorship in which there were very few decisions that were actually taken collectively. So this is limited. This shows a limited experience of democracy and of inclusion, especially combined with the inequalities that I was talking about. So that's why I believe that this proto-political atmosphere signifies a massive change. Diane Davis argued in her book Urban Leviathan that the reason why Mexico City became the chaos that it has become was that because during the 20th century it passed from being regarded as the city of palaces at the beginning of the century to the chaos that it is now, was that the political class dedicated itself to, instead of addressing social needs, to actually just fulfilling favors within networks of clientelistic and corporativistic favors. So it was an exchange of favors to gain support to maintain the legitimacy of the single party regime, which eroded any kind of local empowerment of the people. So I believe that these activists have become very influential because the groups in power thought that mobility was not threatening the status quo, but it has actually changed physically the layout of the city in the networks that I referred to. So it's not only due to activists, it's because of the networks with international financial institutions and other groups, but the activists have learned to manage very interestingly. But it's, as I said, that it is not a linear process. There are tendencies towards centralization. So one of the most important activist groups has tended to sell itself as the most important group that should mediate between the many dozens of other activist groups and the government, and in so doing is trying to centralize some of that kind of legitimacy that activists have been gaining. So I end this presentation paraphrasing a well-known protest song that says that se hace el camino al andar, you make the path as you go along, but I changed the al andar, so it's not walking, but up to cycling. Se hace el camino al rodar. Thank you.